For the sake of timing, I will just briefly, even though I will not do justice by doing it briefly, introduce the panelists that are now in the second segment of today's session. They're also members of the PIN group, PIN standing for Processes of International Negotiations. And Processes of International Negotiations holds yearly workshops and roadshows, as they call them, around the world in which they disseminate their most cutting-edge insights when it comes to processes of negotiation and conflict management in general. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce three PIN members. On my far left is Mark Anstey from Nelson Mandela University and many other universities where he has held positions. Rudolf Schuessler from Bayreuth University in Germany, and Olivier Faure, professor from Sorbonne, but also a globetrotter who is going to also introduce us with his idea, picking up from the experiences that he has collected around the world. The topics that the three panelists today are going to cover kind of can be summarized around the dysfunctional democracies and how identity politics are influencing this dysfunctionality. Can republicanism provide some form of answer to the current disorder? And how to handle some disobedience, some rowdy actors on the global level, i.e. China. I would like to start with Mark Anstey, who is going to introduce us to his ideas on how identity politics and dysfunctional democracies go hand in hand, I would say.
Good afternoon. Yes, I took on this topic foolishly, thinking I could address it in 7 minutes. And started on much firmer ground. I've lived in South Africa all my life. I was very actively participant in the transition process, where we moved from a repressive minority rule to basically a liberal democratic constitution and a full-blooded system of human rights. And I now spend a fair amount of time in England, where I'm watching with great interest Brexit. Both carry heavy identity politics dimensions with them. And every time I think I've got a handle on this, I haven't, because there are other layers coming in. I can perhaps respond to some of the questions you asked Valerie from a South African perspective, and I'm still mediating conflicts in South Africa in ways that attempt to address some of this at a more grassroots level. But let me talk to the bigger topic. What makes a democracy dysfunctional? And we have lists. We know Freedom House produces annual reports of freedoms across nations. We have an estimate of 116 out of 186 nations that have been investigated that remain electoral democracies. But Freedom House believes that democracy is in a crisis. So they're not looking simply at the small rollback that's occurred in the larger definition of what an electoral democracy is. What's worrying them is liberal democracy and the rollback of freedoms, protections for minorities, electoral freedoms, media freedoms, rule of law, transparency, and so on. And then what do we mean by identity politics? People, it's in my mind simply how people define themselves, and then how they are mobilized. Who uses that definition and pushes people into or out of identity groups according to larger political agendas. And that will take us into addressing shortly, if our systems are dysfunctional, and I'm not entirely convinced they are, because things appear to be dissembling, disordered, that is often the energy of regenerating new systems, telling us that there is a breakdown underway, and if we are sensitive to it, we have time to reorder, reshape, regenerate. The worrying thing about all that is who steps up to fill the space. So we come back to a debate about leadership and why the populists who are currently on a surge seem to be better at this in mobilizing support than existing traditional mainstream politicians operating within safe and time-honored structures. And in saying that, I must tell you that when I've been looking at this, democracy is new for all of us. Even the old democracies, full democracy is a new practice. And it has produced complications and issues that are far away from the countries that I work in now that are aspiring to democracy and think it's a point of arrival somehow, rather than a system of, in my mind, that is designed for ongoing problem solving. If in phase one, you are designing a system that will give credibility to leaderships and to problem-solving systems. And then those systems actually have to keep delivering to the people that put them there, and in there lie complications. So we arrived in democracy late. We arrived across the world off completely different historical trajectories. The West had a particular trajectory worked out through blood on what a liberal democracy might look like. Other nations arrived through trajectories of colonialism, long-term repression, underdevelopment in completely different contexts and different shape. So economically, culturally, in terms of tradition and narrative, forms of government have come through completely different trajectories. And then we arrived and we've got a sort of one package fits all. When I look at Europe, I see completely different, a huge diversity of diversity. It's got completely different mixes. Although we use the term diversity, the levels of homogeneity, heterogeneity are different. And if nations are complexly already heterogeneous and experiencing problems, I think that's a different shape of democracy to debate to ones which are seeking to protect their existing homogeneity. You can see why I got confused. I went back to what did we want out of a democracy? And the search starts not for human rights, but for social order. And the need eventually to say, look, the only way we're going to get social order is through some kind of consensus of what the rules should be. And then we've got to agree on who's going to exercise authority for those, consent. And we've got to have governments with capacity. And as we know, the great enemy of democracy is poverty. It removes the capacity to deliver to citizens effectively. If we look at where the national populists are making ground, it's off a basis of fear. We're in a period of huge change, climatically, security, technology. The list has already been gone through by other speakers. And it generates an anxiety. The sort of common dialogue is that the system has lost touch with the people. The politicians that run currently can't be trusted. The systems that have been designed are ineffective for the problem solving, for the problems of the future. Trust us. We're against multiculturalism. We're against immigration. We are against globalization. But of course, largely the people mobilizing this haven't ever sat in positions where they've had to engage with these on a practical level. They're in mobilization mode rather than delivery mode. And some of the pushback perhaps needs to come from, if you're dealing with pushback politics, what do you need in order to respond to that? I'm going to just outline a couple of things. First, credible leadership is critical. The South African transition was managed through changing the narrative from us and them to a joint nation-building project. And it required a particular kind of leadership that mobilized people out of the past and into structures for the future. It's a stumbling and difficult transition that's still a long way from being finished. And there are all kinds of new identity problems because conflicts mutate through time. So credible leadership. The other thing that was critical in our transition period was civil society participation. We didn't just leave it to political leaders. We created structures where people would take ownership of and responsibility for peaceful change on the ground. These are grand missions of reshaping culture, and nation building begins with reshaping culture, and the tolerance is the heart of what democracy is about, and it orders the shape of how you design your systems. I would say this, once you've gone that route, you have to build structures that support the change of narrative, if you want attitude change, and in the new world, which is the longest in democracy, we have multiple identity shapes. Things that are not of concern in the developing world now are busying the courts, dispute resolution mechanisms in the so-called first world. If you want to fix the problems of democracy, the saying goes, more democracy. If you want systems of tolerance, you have to create systems that enable tolerance and provide certainty to people who are in a crisis of uncertainty. And then finally, I just want to say, hold steady. We cannot go a route globally where internal systems nurture intolerance. Because internal systems, even those where you might have sympathy for saying, well, let's keep those guys out. They're not democratic. They're not going to fit in our society. But once you've fingered an external group as being a problem for your internal stability, what happens to the minorities that exist in those nations already? Is the short step not next to discriminate, marginalize, and isolate those groups? So only liberal democratic principles offer protections to individual liberties and minorities. And it's not comfortable. It's hard work. And it requires investment across a wide spread of systems and a bit of courage. And it requires a leadership that will step in and have the courage to reshape the systems and structures to the new shape of problems that are developing. And currently, that space seems to have been left to others.
Thank you very much, Mark. In fact, this gives a good segue to what Rudolf is going to talk about, whether or not republicanism or a specific form of democratic order can give an answer to the world disorder that we're observing today.
Yeah, I'm working very much on similar problems as Mark. I'm a political philosopher, so my considerations are a bit schematic and abstract, but the first thing is I don't see disruption right now. There is disruption on the horizon. It will be technical, and it might be world-changing, but the transitions we see are, I think, quite traditional, and the reasons we see for the traditions I regard as quite traditional too, and that's where republicanism comes in. Republican thought is a very old tradition of thought going back to Greece and Rome, and so why are the problems we see related to it? The point is, it are old problems of republics coming up once more again now, and have been away for a while for different reasons. They have been away because we had a bipolar world system in which we had a totalitarian system against a state, led by a state, which is a liberal democracy. So liberal democracy had the advantage of being challenged, under pressure, under threat, and everybody who was interested in liberty was rallying around liberal democracy because it was under totalitarian pressure. This situation fell away after 1990, and it changed into a different situation in which there was one superpower, one remaining superpower, the liberal democracy par excellence, which tried to spread in the 1990s its ideas, its liberal system over the world. Doing that, it challenged other countries, other cultures, and it wasn't helping them to sustain their life under pressure, but it was trying to impose an idea of liberalism on them. And republicanism is very much about non-domination. That's a quite modern understanding of republicanism, which has been around for 20, 30 years now. But if you focus on non-domination, it makes clear that the spread of liberal democracy has a paradoxical side. It liberates the individuals, but of course by dominating their way of thought. So if people have an interest in their own liberty as non-domination internally in the state, they may also have an interest that their state is not dominated by other states. That's the classical definition. That's what in Greece and Rome was part of classical republicanism. The state should be strong enough due to the civic virtue of the citizens to be not dominated by other states. That was important for Athens, and of course Rome was strong enough to dominate others, but basically dominating others implies that you first are not dominated by other states. So if your interest, the interest of the citizens is in their state not being dominated, as part of their civic liberty, liberal democracy has a problem. Liberal democracy has the problem that if it is spread by violent means or by missionary means that are not chiming in with the culture in which it is transported, it becomes dominating over the state. And people might resist, in the interest of their liberty as non-domination, the spread of liberal democracy. Question is, does this happen? What we see in countries like Russia or China, at least partly, might be explained by their populations legitimizing the rulers. These people are not utterly dissatisfied with the rulers and with their lack of civic liberties because they believe the rulers make sure their country is not dominated by other countries, and in this way just serving their republican liberty. If you want to overcome the situation, we'll have to understand that exclusive reliance on liberal democracy and on the values of liberal democracy will not bring us far, as long as the liberal democracy is not able to be a global hegemon. It will not be able to overcome the interest of different cultures and countries not to be dominated. We see this now in the actual interactions between China and the US. And it's quite interesting that traditional realism in the international relations is not very fit to explain what's happening because most of what is happening is on the economic side, not on the military side. So it's about economic domination or becoming economic equal. It's not about military equality. This was the main issue between Russia or the USSR and the West. It was a struggle for military equality or military superiority. This was the issue of realism. It's no longer the case. The USSR was economically too weak to be a competitor to the US. Now we have China, which is militarily too weak to be a competitor to the US, but economically strong enough to be an economic competitor. So the struggle moves to the economic side, and we'll see attempts at domination and refusal of domination or non-domination on the economic side. So if we want to understand this, we have to move from realism to republicanism, or we have to include republican elements into ideas of international order or realism. And I think if we do that, we'll understand that we'll have to take care to look at several very, very specific points if you want to avoid large-scale conflict in the world order as it is. And nothing of this has to do with technological disruption. It has to do with shifting lines of resources and trade from oil to rare earth or coltan and other things. So different regions of the world will become important than they had been before. And it has to do with attempts to make sure that no country can be economically dominated by other countries. And if this is done, we'll might have a chance to mitigate the conflicts that are brewing. And nothing of this has really to do with military superiority, because you don't need a strong military, and it doesn't help you necessarily. What you need is a adequately structured economy that is resilient against pressure from the outside or can exert pressures in order to retain its dominance. And the shift from the military paradigm we had in the bipolar world of the USSR-US conflict to the economic and economic domination paradigm is, I think, what we see on a world level now. And then there are lots of conflicts which are simply a fallout of this problem, because the Middle East becomes less important because the focus shifts from oil to other resources. Because the Middle East is less important to the world powers, they just have less interest in mitigating or freezing conflict there. And if we follow this line, we might have a chance to understand what's happening. I think we should do it quickly, because I'm sure the technological disruption which is on the horizon will catch up with us soon, in 10, 20 years, and then we'll have, again, a completely different set of problems with robot wars, with probably artificial intelligence involved in international politics and things like that. But what that's going to be, I don't know. Thank you for your...
Thank you very much, Rudolf. Last but not least, as the saying goes, Olivier Faure, with the focus on China, which has been now sneaking into the conversation.
Sure, it's in the mind of everybody. I've been working for 30 years on Chinese issues, and I want just to bring you something that I believe are essential to be able to handle the relation to China in a more effective way. Explore first the Chinese mindset. Know and understand China, and after we can be far more effective than if we start with our mindset, our values, and we move on like we do now, which is, of course, the wrong way. The cognitive map of the Chinese is totally original and unique. China in Chinese is Zhongguo, which China is a word we invented to call them, but it's never been called like that. Zhongguo is the center of the world. It's the axis of the world. It's the civilization. I mean, it means a lot to them. Everything starts from that. And then there is today another element that comes to the fore, the hyper-patriotic stance. Territoriality is still something essential, vital to them. And more, I want to go quickly on one thing. Historically speaking, when we look at China and the rest of the world, it's simple. They expanded with a strategy which is that of the oil spot. They expand slowly, touch upon other groups, other societies, other nations, and explained. I mean, they turn them slowly on, because they have enough weight for that, as a tributary. So there is a new deal, which is quite interesting, which is, okay, China says, we bring a lot of good to you, a lot of good. You will have a great benefit to interact with us, but under one condition: we are the boss. So politically speaking, we are the leader. We're there, and you'll benefit from it. This is the idea of tributary. Understand that today it's again going on this way, except that they cannot conquer any more territory. But economically speaking, they try to grab as much of the resources of the world, which is rational in their own view and according to their own needs. They need those resources. They cannot expand. They cannot cultivate more rice in China. They cannot, there's enough mine. They cannot discover new mines, etc. So this is typically what they do with the new Silk Roads. Obor is made to do that. It's a modern way to expand with still the traditional mindset. So a word on the power issues. China typically try to push as much as possible. They do it with the Spratly Islands. They do it with the Paracels, with Gwadar in Pakistan, with Sri Lanka, with Central Asia, etc. But they are extremely realistic. They're not stupid with that. They know that they are weak. They know that their strength is not at all something so important today to impose anything. They're far behind the US on hard and soft power. They know that very well. I discussed with the leaders there, and they're extremely realistic, but they try as much as possible. They use very often rhetorics that go far beyond what they really want. And they consider it as a smart way to appear as important in the map of the world, in the political map. Their mindset is clearly a zero-sum game. When they negotiate, they play zero-sum because they understand in their mind it cannot be anything else than zero-sum, but they know us very well. They've been well aware that we love to hear win-win. We play win-win games, etc. So they repeat it. I mean, if you discuss with Chinese, every quarter of an hour they will drop a win-win. But it's just like win-win is not in the mindset of any Chinese. Win-win should be maybe the name of a panda in a Sichuan zoo. That's all. And then what we have is, what they play is, Sun Tzu strategies. Sun Tzu strategy, the 36 stratagems, etc. I mean, they play tough. They always have a hidden agenda. This is basic in China. It's not to be unpleasant. It's not to be tricky. It's in their culture. You never play direct. You have to do it indirectly. So you never ask for what you want. And opacity is really their zone of comfort, the Chinese. What makes us so awfully uncomfortable is fine to them. It's natural, it's normal, and they can handle that beautifully with some of their tradition like Taoism, etc. I want to say a last thing about the attributes. They are extremely face concerned. Face is essential, and we can play with that. In a moment, I'm going to go to the recommendations. We can play a lot because it has no cost to us, and we can achieve a lot of things with that. So if we look at now at the world order, or as Bill Zartman said it, and I think it's very strong and good and smart and accurate, the world disorder, how to handle this smartly, this world disorder, I would say we have a newcomer, okay, with a different history, different methods of handling problems, and a different cognitive map, which is China. Okay, so the EU, I discussed with them a lot, is not a threat for China. It's not a big issue. It's, they consider the European Union as, well, fine, but there's not much to say. But the US is a real counterpart and the real competitor. And I think the US should definitely resist, should draw a red line somewhere. In many situations, like I think about the Spratly Islands, etc., and it's not going to be something that will harm, I think, peace any longer. China will go escalating with rhetorics, but only with rhetorics. They know how far they can go. They know their own limits. They have a lot of very important problems, much more than we believe. China is still a developing country, it's a third world country with a lot of domestic issues. I don't spend all my life in Beijing and Shanghai. I've been to 20 provinces working there. I've been in the countryside. I stayed even with farmers. I can tell you this is really the third world. This is an extremely poor country. They have so many problems to handle that conquering the world is not really their idea now. Okay, then the Chinese culture is typically Taoist, which means what? Harmony, balance, and a sense of how far can we go without going too far. But last not the least, we must give enough face to China, and there'll be a lot of benefits. I want to conclude with just a couple of recommendations. The first one is do not escalate. Do not demonize China either. Do not play might makes right, as we said before. Do not try to impose or to sell Western values. We think we are doing good. No, it's really something that leads us nowhere with the Chinese. We have not just to satisfy ourselves, but try to reach some result. Show limits, show firmness, show the bottom line, how far we can go ourselves. The Chinese will always push until they realize that there is a real bottom line. So we have to show it at some point, and then finally save Chinese face. There's no cost, and it's essential for them. And then the relation will cool down for the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our panel because we are time constrained as we have been signaled. But please join me in a round of applause for all our panelists for today for a very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you, everyone, and good luck with the rest of the conference. This is the banner for the special issue. As you can see, Globsec is one of our also sponsors. We're very proud to have Globsec as part of the team. So please have a look at the special issue as it's coming out. Thank you very much.